Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to open a vault of secrets, alliances, betrayals, and shadow wars, because this is the secret history behind Iran and Israel's hatred, a story that spans decades and reshaped the Middle East as we know it. At first, they were allies, unlikely partners bound by strategy, not ideology. Iran under the Shah quietly supported Israel, while Mossad and Savak worked hand in hand. But in 1979, everything changed. The Islamic Revolution flipped the script, and Israel became public enemy number one. From proxy wars in Lebanon to assassinations and cyber attacks, what followed was a Cold War fought in shadows, with real blood. This story goes far beyond headlines. It's a deep dive into ideology, religion, fear, and power. And tonight, we're going to trace it all, from warm beginnings to bitter hatred. But before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? What time is it for you? Are you listening to fall asleep or just killing time while soaking up some history? And if you enjoy the kinds of stories I tell, consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and lets me keep making content like this. Now, let's get into the full story. In the quiet spaces between headlines and history books, there's a chapter many don't know. One where Israel and Iran were not enemies, but cautious, calculating friends. Strange to think about now, given what the relationship has become. But before the storm of revolutions and rhetoric, there was a time when these two nations, so different in religion and culture, found common ground in the shadows of the Cold War. It was the 1950s. Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, known more simply as the Shah. He was a monarch with a fondness for Western suits and modernity, trying to pull his country toward the future with one hand, while balancing centuries of Persian tradition with the other. In the same decade, the State of Israel had just been born, still raw from war, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and desperate for allies. Most Muslim majority countries refused to recognize Israel's existence at all, let alone work with it. But Iran took a different route. Though Iran never officially recognized Israel in a diplomatic sense, behind closed doors, the two governments began to talk. These weren't public handshakes or grand alliances. They were whispered meetings, silent agreements, nods across tables far from cameras. It was pragmatic, not emotional. Iran needed weapons, training, and intelligence. Israel needed fuel, support, and regional connections. And both needed to navigate the rising tide of Arab nationalism that threatened to drown them. One of the strongest bridges between the two nations was oil. Israeli tankers slipped quietly into Iranian ports and left filled with precious crude. In return, Israel provided agricultural expertise, weapons technology, and perhaps most importantly, intelligence. Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, worked closely with Savak, the Shah's secret police. Together, they monitored threats from within and without, particularly those aligned with the Soviet Union or Arab nationalism. A declassified CIA memo from 1974 referred to Israel and Iran as natural allies in a region divided by ideology. And, in a way, they were. They both saw themselves as islands of stability in a sea of chaos. Both pro-Western, both skeptical of pan-Arabism, both deeply concerned about the rise of Soviet influence in the region. There's an old rumor, never fully confirmed, but often repeated among former diplomats, that Mossad helped Savak train its operatives in surveillance and counterinsurgency techniques. According to one former Iranian intelligence officer, interviewed decades later, it was the Israelis who taught us how to listen to walls, how to track voices through dust, how to see without being seen. Of course, these weren't peaceful times. Even then, Iran was walking a tightrope. The Shah's regime was increasingly autocratic, with rising opposition from both secular and religious forces. At the same time, Israel was fighting for its survival in a region that still didn't accept its right to exist. But while much of the Arab world was united against Israel, Iran stood apart, partially because it wasn't Arab. Ethnically Persian and culturally distinct, Iran didn't feel the same pressure to conform to the political goals of Egypt, Iraq, or Syria. There were even occasional visits. Not state visits, not official ceremonies, but enough to keep the connection alive. Israeli officials and business people operated through Iranian intermediaries, and Tehran quietly allowed Israeli diplomats to work out of a trade office masquerading as a business hub. By the early 1970s, the relationship was at its peak. The two countries had built a covert oil pipeline stretching from Iran to the Mediterranean coast, bypassing Arab-controlled territories entirely. Known as the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, it was a multi-million-dollar project that existed almost entirely out of public view. Documents related to its construction remained classified in both countries for years, only surfacing in pieces through investigative reporting and court documents decades later. Even culturally, there were faint but real connections. Iranian Jews, though a minority, were relatively protected under the Shah, and some even traveled to Israel for religious pilgrimages or business. There were Iranian students studying in Tel Aviv, and Israeli engineers working in Iranian infrastructure projects. None of this made the headlines, but it stitched the two countries together in subtle ways. Still, it wasn't an alliance built to last. It was built on shared interests, not shared values, and when the winds began to shift in Iran, those old foundations began to crack. By 1978, the streets of Tehran were filling with protesters. Some were leftists, angry at the Shah's corruption and inequality. Others were devout Muslims, furious at what they saw as the regime's abandonment of Islamic values. But what united them was a growing sense that the Shah was a puppet of the West, too close to the United States, too deferential to Israel, too willing to suppress his own people to keep foreign powers happy. And in that growing fire, the secret friendship with Israel became not just inconvenient, but dangerous. When the revolution finally erupted in 1979, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to lead the birth of the Islamic Republic, the relationship didn't just end, it was erased. Almost overnight, Israel went from silent partner to sworn enemy. Iranian embassies removed Israeli flags. State media began referring to Israel not as a country, but as a Zionist regime. And the new government made it clear that any cooperation with the Jewish state would be seen as treasonous. But those days before the fall, those golden years of secret pacts, oil deals, and whispered phone calls, remain a strange and almost forgotten chapter in the story of two nations now locked in quiet enmity. It's a reminder that even the most bitter rivals were not always enemies. That history isn't just written in wars and treaties, but in backrooms, hidden pipelines, and the small decisions made by men in suits trying to keep the storm at bay. The crowd that had once whispered their discontent in cafes and mosques was now marching openly through the streets of Tehran, Qom, Isfahan. The chants grew louder with each day. Death to the Shah, death to America, and death to Israel. Banners with the face of a long-exiled cleric began to appear on walls, rooftops, in marketplaces, and outside universities. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, and although few outside Iran had heard much of him just a year earlier, his voice, smuggled on cassette tapes, passed hand to hand, was becoming impossible to ignore. By early 1979, the revolution was no longer just a protest movement. It was a tidal wave. The Shah fled the country in January, and within weeks, Khomeini returned from exile in Paris to a rapturous reception. His face, once banned by the regime, now looked down from balconies and was painted across school walls. In a country where monarchy had ruled for millennia, Iran was suddenly becoming something the world had never quite seen before, a modern theocracy ruled by religious law. And within that new system, Israel's place was suddenly, violently erased. The change wasn't gradual. It came quickly, almost surgically. The Israeli mission in Tehran, operating quietly under the guise of a trade office, was stormed. Its staff fled. The building was seized and handed over, symbolically, to the Palestine Liberation Organization. Within hours, the Israeli flag was torn down and replaced with the red, black, green, and white of Palestine. In his first speeches as supreme leader, Khomeini left no doubt about his views. Israel, he said, was a cancerous growth that had to be cut from the body of the Islamic world. It was not merely a political rival, not even a colonial project in his eyes, but a spiritual enemy, a direct affront to Islam. The term Little Satan was coined during this time, a counterpart to Great Satan, the title reserved for the United States. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was doctrine. Almost overnight, decades of backdoor diplomacy were not just undone, but forbidden. Anyone in Iran associated with Israeli businesses, or even with Iranian Jews who had ties to Tel Aviv, suddenly had reason to fear. Several were arrested, some disappeared, others fled. A quiet but steady exodus of Iranian Jews began, many of them bound for Los Angeles, Paris, or, quietly, Israel. Anti-Israeli sentiment became institutionalized. It appeared in schoolbooks, television broadcasts, government slogans. The phrase Marg Bar Israel, death to Israel, became a chant, not only shouted at protests but printed on currency, stamped on official correspondence, woven into murals that still cover walls across Iranian cities today. There was a psychological element to all this as well. For a revolution built on the premise that foreign influence had corrupted Iran's soul, Israel became a symbol of everything the new regime claimed to despise: Westernism, secularism, military occupation, and economic manipulation. It didn't matter that Iran had once been complicit in those ties. That was the old world. The new one needed enemies to purify itself, and Israel fit the role almost too well. Behind the fury, though, there were practical concerns. Khomeini and his advisors knew that isolating Iran from the West would come at a cost. But they also believed that by positioning Iran as the champion of Palestinian liberation, and by extension, the leader of the anti-Zionist Islamic world, they could gain something even more valuable: legitimacy, influence, a place of moral and political authority across the Middle East. And in many places it worked. Iran's tough stance on Israel won admiration from Arab populations who had grown disillusioned with their own leaders' inability to stop Israeli expansion after the 1967 and 1973 wars. Posters of Khomeini began appearing in Cairo, Damascus, and even parts of Beirut. Though Arab governments were often wary of Iran's Shiite identity, they couldn't deny the power of its rhetoric. Interestingly, in the first few months after the revolution, Israel didn't entirely give up hope. Some Israeli officials believed the regime might moderate once in power, or that economic necessity would force Iran to re-engage quietly. There were even indirect communications through European intermediaries. But these efforts faded quickly. In April 1980, Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. That moment shattered any lingering illusions. Iran was charting a new path, one where Israel would have no place except as an eternal adversary. The shift wasn't only external. Inside Iran, cultural and political life was being reshaped to align with this worldview. Friday sermons broadcast on state television regularly included denunciations of the Zionist regime. State-sponsored children's books showed young martyrs fighting Israeli tanks. The New Revolutionary Guards, or IRGC, founded in 1979 to defend the revolution, were trained not just to secure borders but to export the revolution's ideology, including its fight against Israel abroad. This was no longer a cold, diplomatic break. It was a moral confrontation. There's something haunting about how quickly it all transformed. Just a few years earlier, Israeli and Iranian officials had been quietly toasting over oil contracts and intelligence briefings. Now, Iran's highest spiritual leader was calling for Israel's destruction from the pulpit. What was once transactional had become theological. The revolution also hardened Israel's view of Iran. For Israeli leadership, especially Prime Minister Menachem Begin at the time, the fall of the Shah wasn't just the loss of a regional partner. It was the birth of a new kind of threat. An ideological enemy willing to endure isolation, sanctions, and war for the sake of its beliefs. One that believed patience was a virtue, and that time was on its side. In a televised interview years later, former Israeli ambassador Yuri Lubrani said, "We knew we had lost Iran forever the moment they turned our embassy into the Palestinian one. That wasn't just policy, that was theatre. It was a performance meant to say, we've burned the bridge, and we won't rebuild it. What emerged in place of diplomacy was a slow-burning hostility, quiet at first, but deeply rooted. It wasn't just about borders or resources anymore. It was about identity. Iran had wrapped its new self-image in resistance to Zionism, and Israel, in turn, had begun to see Iran not as a rogue state, but as an existential threat. The lines had been drawn, not with tanks or planes, but with slogans, symbols, and silence. There's a particular kind of silence that lingers after a war, a silence that hums in the empty streets and broken buildings, and clings to the air like smoke that refuses to clear. That was southern Lebanon in the early 1980s. After Israel's 1982 invasion, meant to expel the Palestine Liberation Organization, a new force began to rise. Not a national army, not a government, but a network of fighters forged in ideology, faith, and resentment. They called themselves Hezbollah, the Party of God. And unlike the PLO, this new group wasn't looking to negotiate borders or sign shaky peace agreements. Their enemy wasn't just a foreign occupier, it was a theological aberration, something to be resisted absolutely. Hezbollah was Iran's answer to the Israeli presence in Lebanon. And far more than that, it was a tool, a message, and a promise. The connection between Iran and Hezbollah wasn't accidental. Just 3 years after the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, had already begun moving personnel and resources into Lebanon. They arrived in the Bekaa Valley under the guise of military advisors, quietly training and funding local Shia militias that had been radicalized by the chaos and brutality of the Lebanese civil war. But Hezbollah wasn't just a militia. From the beginning, it was shaped in Tehran's image. Iranian religious texts were distributed alongside Kalashnikovs. Speeches by Ayatollah Khomeini were broadcast in Shia neighborhoods through loudspeakers nailed to the sides of buildings. And most importantly, the group adopted the same uncompromising stance toward Israel, referring to it only as the Zionist entity, denying its legitimacy, and calling openly for its destruction. By 1985, Hezbollah had officially declared its existence. In its founding manifesto, translated years later, it described Israel as an illegitimate usurper entity and America as the Great Satan. That document didn't read like a standard political platform. It was more like a declaration of religious war, wrapped in revolutionary language. And from that point forward, Iran had something it had never really possessed before: a direct, armed proxy on Israel's doorstep. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Hezbollah's operations grew bolder. What began as ambushes on Israeli convoys in southern Lebanon evolved into suicide bombings, cross-border kidnappings, and rocket fire aimed at northern Israeli towns. The attacks were often brutal and deliberately designed for maximum psychological impact. But what made Hezbollah different wasn't just their tactics, it was their endurance. They didn't fade away like other militias. They embedded themselves in Lebanese society, building hospitals, schools, and television stations, funded in no small part by Iranian money. That financial pipeline ran deep. Estimates from intelligence reports suggest that Iran provided Hezbollah with tens of millions of dollars annually throughout the 1990s, a figure that would balloon in the following decades. In return, Hezbollah didn't just act as a regional irritant. It became a strategic arm of Iran's military vision, a way to strike Israel without risking direct confrontation. One of the most devastating moments in this shadow war came far from the Middle East. In March of 1992, a car bomb exploded outside the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. 29 people were killed, and over 200 were wounded. 2 years later, in 1994, another bombing destroyed the AMIA Jewish Community Center in the same city, killing 85 more. Investigators traced both attacks back to Hezbollah operatives, working with logistical and financial support from Iran's intelligence services. It's a strange detail, isn't it, that a feud between two countries in the Middle East would spill so violently onto the streets of South America. But it was part of a larger pattern. Iran and Hezbollah were testing the limits of indirect warfare, sending a clear signal that Israeli interests, no matter how far from Tel Aviv, were not safe. In 2006, that long simmering conflict erupted again, this time with extraordinary visibility. The spark was familiar. 2 Israeli soldiers were kidnapped by Hezbollah near the border. Israel responded with force, launching airstrikes across Lebanon. What followed became known as the 2006 Lebanon War, a 34-day conflict that killed over 1,000 Lebanese civilians and more than 100 Israeli soldiers. The war shocked many with Hezbollah's resilience. Despite Israel's overwhelming air superiority, the group managed to fire over 4,000 rockets into Israeli territory. Many of those rockets were supplied or funded by Iran. In fact, the post-war reports from Israeli intelligence and the UN detailed how advanced Iranian-made Fajr 5 missiles had been smuggled into southern Lebanon in the years prior. These weren't crude homemade devices. They were military-grade weapons, guided by satellite coordinates, capable of striking deeper into Israeli cities than ever before. And Hezbollah, in many ways, became Iran's proof of concept. It had built a state within a state, with its own security forces, economy, media, and foreign policy. All of it operated parallel to the Lebanese government, often overriding it, and all of it served Iranian interests. One retired Israeli intelligence officer, quoted anonymously in a 2010 report, put it plainly. Hezbollah is not just Iran's finger, it's their fist. If Iran ever feels truly cornered, that fist will swing. But what's perhaps even more unsettling is how Hezbollah has continued to evolve. In recent years, reports have emerged that the group now possesses precision-guided missiles, advanced surveillance drones, and tunnel systems beneath the border with Israel. Many of these capabilities were developed with Iranian assistance, either directly or through shared expertise with other allies like Syria. It's no longer just about defense or harassment. Hezbollah, fueled by Iran's ideological fervor and military training, now represents a credible threat in the event of full-scale war. Still, despite everything, decades of blood, explosions, declarations, there's a strange sense of distance in how Iran engages with Israel. It rarely attacks directly. Its generals don't march across borders. Instead, it plays a longer game, shaping movements, manipulating battlefields, turning local struggles into geopolitical tools. Some call it asymmetric warfare. Others call it plausible deniability. But whatever the label, the result is the same. Hezbollah has become a permanent feature of the northern Israeli border, a looming presence whose silence is as ominous as its firepower. A whisper that reminds both countries that peace is not guaranteed, that this is a war fought through shadows. And perhaps that's what makes this conflict so unnerving. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a hum beneath the headlines, a quiet arrangement of power, ideology, and blood that stretches from the hills of Lebanon to the ministries of Tehran. It waits, it watches, and it does not forget. Continuing from our exploration of Hezbollah's rise and Iran's influence in Lebanon, the story pivots now to a spectre that haunted Israel's very foundations: Iran's nuclear ambitions. It may surprise some to know that Iran's nuclear journey began long before the revolution, reaching back into the 1950s, under the Shah's reign, with support from the United States and the Atoms for Peace initiative. This program, launched by President Eisenhower in 1953, aimed to share nuclear technology for civilian energy development, and Iran signed on, laying the groundwork for what would become a full-fledged nuclear program by the mid-1970s. The Shah envisioned dozens of nuclear power plants, producing 23,000 megawatts of electricity, an audacious dream that abruptly ended amid swirling revolution and war. After the 1979 revolution, and during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, Iran quietly restarted work on its nuclear capabilities, driven by strategic anxiety and national humiliation. Western experts later confirmed that by 2003, Iran had violated its safeguards obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, though their investigations found no decision to build a bomb until that point. Israel's unease over the slow-burning nuclear project had deep roots. In 1981, under Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Israel launched Operation Opera, a surprise airstrike that destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor near Baghdad. This was no one-off. It established what became known as the Begin Doctrine. Israel would not permit any hostile regional power to develop nuclear weapons capability. This doctrine cast a long shadow over Iran's ambitions. Fast forward to the early 2000s, evidence surfaced of Iran operating secret uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow. By 2012, Iran declared it had begun enriching uranium up to 20% at Fordow, and soon was producing material enriched to nearly 60%, far closer to weapons-grade uranium. Every report from the International Atomic Energy Agency heightened Israeli alarm, though the IAEA consistently noted that Iran had not definitively decided to pursue nuclear arms. The speed at which Tehran enriched uranium meant that the period between a final decision and a deliverable weapon had shrunk dramatically from months to possibly weeks. In response, Israel intensified its covert efforts. Over the years, Mossad allegedly orchestrated operations targeting Iranian nuclear scientists. In 2018, agents reportedly entered Tehran to seize nuclear archives, exposing a trove of documents detailing weaponization studies. And through cyber warfare, Israel, often alongside the US, infiltrated Natanz via Stuxnet in 2010, disabling centrifuges and delaying Iran's program. These moves were part of a wider intelligence and sabotage campaign operating in the shadows. But tensions peaked in June 2025, when Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a series of airstrikes against Iran's nuclear and military facilities, including Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, Iraq, and even military bases where key scientists operated. The official aim was clear: to prevent any path toward nuclear capability that could one day threaten Israel's existence. The strike on Arak on June 19, 2025, was symbolic. A heavy water reactor never fully operational, but capable of producing plutonium, an alternative route to nuclear weapons. Israel insisted it was targeting future threats rather than current ones, conscious of the dangers in hitting such sites. The IAEA, while condemning attacks on nuclear infrastructure, acknowledged Arak posed a possible military risk. Almost immediately, Iran retaliated, firing missiles deep into southern Israel, targeting civilian areas and hospitals. The conflict reached a fevered pitch, with hundreds of casualties on both sides and the specter of full-scale war looming. This latest escalation echoes past Israeli strikes on Syria in 2007, where an atomic reactor was demolished before becoming operational. It underscores that, 2 decades on, the Begin Doctrine is still very much active. Yet, the narrative is complex. Iran continues to profess peaceful intentions, and international bodies like the IAEA caution that evidence of weaponization remains inconclusive. Still, with enriched uranium stocks soaring and a network of fortified underground facilities, Israel perceives an existential threat. An intelligence analysis, like that from the Institute for Science and International Security, warns that Iran could assemble enough weapon-grade uranium for a bomb within weeks if it decided to proceed. Here lies the transformation. What began as energy infrastructure under a monarchy evolved through revolution, war, and technological escalation into a flashpoint of modern geopolitics. It is a tale marked by preemption, subterfuge, and the delicate interplay between civilian aspiration and military peril. In the low hum of night, I imagine the corridors of those secret weapons facilities, the faint glow of centrifuges spinning, and the decisions being made in Tehran that rattle Tel Aviv and Beirut alike. It is a high-stakes chess game, where each move, covert or overt, carries the weight of many lives in the stability of a region. And yet, even now, in this charged atmosphere, no one can say for certain what final move lies ahead. Could negotiation rise from this dust? Or will escalating reprisals keep building a ladder toward conflict? As this quiet war of atoms unfolds, it leaves behind more questions than answers, and yet it demands our attention. Because in the end, this is not just a story about nations or weapons. It is a story about fear, ambition, and the lengths to which societies will go when they feel existentially threatened. The silence between wars is rarely empty. Behind the surface of public speeches and diplomatic statements, another kind of battle has been unfolding. One not measured by territory gained or soldiers lost, but by silent servers, corrupted code, and the shiver of metal beneath a car before it explodes. If the nuclear issue is the most visible aspect of Israel and Iran's hostility, the shadow war is the one most easily overlooked, yet perhaps the most active. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. In 2009, computers at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility started malfunctioning. Engineers were baffled. Centrifuges that had been operating smoothly began spinning out of control and destroying themselves. There was no immediate explanation. It wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense. No bombs, no gunfire, just code. What they eventually discovered was a computer worm, later called Stuxnet. It was a sophisticated cyber weapon unlike anything the world had seen before. It specifically targeted Siemens software used in the control systems of uranium enrichment centrifuges. It exploited multiple unknown vulnerabilities, what cybersecurity experts call 0 days, and could manipulate the machines while displaying false normal readings to the operators. The worm is widely believed to have been developed jointly by the United States and Israel, although neither has officially confirmed it. The effect was stunning. Reports suggest that roughly 1,000 of Iran's 5,000 active centrifuges were damaged or destroyed. It set the program back by months, maybe years. But even more than the physical damage, it marked a turning point. Warfare had entered a new, quiet domain. Iran, in turn, began developing its own cyber capabilities. The Iranian hacker group APT-33, linked to the Revolutionary Guard, launched attacks not just on Israeli targets, but on Saudi oil infrastructure, American banks, and even European universities. In one notable case, the Shamoon virus crippled the computer systems of Saudi Aramco in 2012, wiping data from 30,000 machines. Iran's message was clear. If it couldn't respond with traditional weapons, it would with code. In Israel, cybersecurity experts started noticing something odd. Attacks on water treatment facilities, public transportation, and hospitals were rising. In April 2020, a cyber attack tried to poison water in Israeli towns by increasing chlorine levels. It was caught in time, but the implications were sobering. Israel responded almost immediately, targeting the port of Shahid Raji in Iran. For days, computer systems there froze, causing massive backups and delays. Then there were the assassinations. Shadowy, clinical, surgical. On January 12, 2010, Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a physics professor at the University of Tehran, was killed by a bomb planted on a motorcycle outside his home. Iranian media blamed the Zionist regime. In November of that same year, Majid Shararari, a nuclear scientist, was assassinated by a car bomb. Another, Feridun Abbasi, survived a nearly identical attempt the very same morning. The attackers used magnetic bombs attached by motorcycle and timed to explode seconds later, a method that would soon become disturbingly familiar. In total, at least 5 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed between 2010 and 2015. Most were involved in uranium enrichment or theoretical physics tied to potential weaponization. Israel never claimed responsibility, but former Mossad officials have hinted at involvement in interviews. One retired Israeli official, speaking anonymously to the New York Times, simply said, "They were not the kind of people you want running a weapons program." Iran retaliated in its own ways. In 2012, Israeli diplomats were targeted in New Delhi, Tbilisi, and Bangkok. The New Delhi bombing injured the Israeli ambassador's wife and driver. Investigations tied the incidents to Iran's Quds Force, the elite foreign operations wing of the Revolutionary Guard. This back and forth, cyber strikes, assassinations, embassy bombings, was a war with no declared battlefield, no front lines, only shadows, shifting loyalties, and operations denied by everyone involved. The depth of the conflict sometimes spilled into the open. In 2018, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stepped onto a stage in Tel Aviv with a series of slides and a row of metal cabinets. Inside them, he claimed, were 55,000 pages and 183 CDs containing Iran's secret nuclear files. The material, he said, had been extracted from a warehouse in Tehran by Mossad agents in a single night. It was a theatrical moment, but it wasn't theater. Months later, US intelligence confirmed that Israel had provided raw documents corroborating details of Iran's nuclear past, including plans for testing weapon components. But the digital front grew ever more sophisticated. Iran turned to influence operations, using fake social media accounts to spread disinformation, target dissenters, and even interfere in elections abroad. Israel, meanwhile, continued building what is arguably one of the world's most advanced cyber armies, coordinated in large part through Unit 820, its elite signals intelligence branch. Alumni of the unit often go on to lead global cybersecurity firms, but within its classified walls, digital espionage remains relentless. There are moments in this silent war that feel deeply human. In one interview, a former Israeli cyber operative described the feeling of watching Iranian systems in real time. You're watching the cursor move across the screen, opening files, logging into servers, and you know they don't know you're there. It's like walking through someone's house while they sleep. Yet there's also something unsettling about how normal it has become. An entire domain of warfare waged without oversight, without international law fully catching up. For every Stuxnet, there are likely dozens of smaller intrusions we'll never hear about. Small sabotage, intelligence theft, misinformation, all of it feeding into a larger machinery of distrust. And the thing about cyber weapons is, unlike a bomb, they don't stay in one place. Malware designed for Natanz can find its way into corporate servers in Europe, or the laptops of journalists. Code doesn't recognize borders the way missiles do. That's part of the risk, and part of the reason the stakes feel so slippery. When asked whether the covert conflict was more dangerous than traditional war, former CIA Director Michael Hayden once said, "Stuxnet was the first weapon made entirely out of ones and zeros, and that genie doesn't go back in the bottle." This is the quiet war, the one fought in lines of code, in secret meetings, in flickers of motion on security cameras. It is often invisible, but always present, and sometimes it is more powerful than armies. The skies above Syria have become a strange kind of map. Not a map of borders or nations, but of threats, warnings, and invisible red lines. Lines drawn not on paper, but with missiles, drones, and whispered intelligence. Since 2011, Syria has been more than a civil war. It has been a crucible for regional rivalries, and among the most persistent and dangerous of them is the quiet, relentless confrontation between Iran and Israel. When the Syrian uprising first began, it was an internal matter. Protests against Bashar al-Assad's authoritarian rule. But as the regime cracked down and the chaos deepened, other players stepped into the void. Iran saw an opportunity, not just to preserve an ally, but to entrench itself along Israel's northern frontier. Iran's support for Assad came swiftly and heavily. Elite units from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, especially the Quds Force, began flowing into Syria, alongside Iranian military advisors and weapons. Hezbollah fighters, hardened from years of conflict with Israel, crossed the border from Lebanon to bolster Assad's crumbling army. In Iran's eyes, Syria wasn't just a battlefield, it was a strategic corridor, linking Tehran to the Mediterranean through Iraq and Lebanon. Some analysts call this the Shia Crescent. Israel, watching from the Golan Heights, saw something else entirely. The IRGC wasn't just helping Assad, it was building weapons depots, drone launch sites, and intelligence facilities deep within Syrian territory. These installations, many disguised within civilian infrastructure, crept closer and closer to the Israeli border. That's when the airstrikes began. Israel rarely confirms its actions, but between 2013 and 2023, hundreds of Israeli air raids have been reported across Syria. Most occurred at night. The targets: IRGC positions, Hezbollah convoys, missile shipments, and weapons factories. A former Israeli Air Force general once described the campaign as mowing the lawn, a constant effort to degrade Iran's capabilities without triggering all-out war. In 2018, tensions peaked. Iranian forces in Syria allegedly launched a salvo of 20 rockets toward Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. Israel responded immediately. Operation House of Cards, as it was later called, targeted dozens of Iranian sites across Syria in a single night. Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman declared that the Iranian presence in Syria is not immune. We will act against it whenever and wherever we need to. The message was clear. Iran could not use Syria as a staging ground. But Iran didn't stop. It began investing in so-called denial facilities, military bases built near Russian outposts or in densely populated areas, hoping to deter Israeli strikes. Some operations shifted underground. Weapons moved at odd hours, sometimes hidden in humanitarian convoys or civilian trucks. The war became more elusive, more surgical. And still, the strikes continued. In August 2023, Israeli jets hit Damascus International Airport, reportedly destroying a shipment of precision-guided missiles meant for Hezbollah. The airspace above Syria, cluttered with Russian, American, Turkish, and Israeli flights, had become one of the most surveilled and contested patches of sky on the planet. To understand how surreal this battlefield is, it helps to hear the language used by military analysts. They don't talk in absolutes. They talk about deconfliction lines, operational envelopes, mutually understood thresholds. A war without formal declarations or front lines requires a constant, whispered calibration of what is tolerated and what isn't. Israel's so-called red lines in Syria are threefold. First, no advanced weapons transfers to Hezbollah. Second, no Iranian entrenchment near the Golan. Third, no strategic air defense systems that could limit Israel's freedom to operate. When any of these lines are crossed, the response tends to come quickly, often before dawn. For civilians in Damascus or Homs, the sound of low-flying jets and sudden explosions has become a rhythm of life. One Syrian man interviewed by the BBC said, "We can tell when it's the Israelis. The blasts are sharper, faster. They don't wait. They strike and vanish." Russia adds another layer to this uneasy equation. Its military presence in Syria complicates Israeli operations. Though Israel and Russia maintain a deconfliction hotline to avoid accidental clashes, there have been close calls. In September 2018, a Russian surveillance plane was accidentally shot down by Syrian air defenses during an Israeli strike. 15 Russian servicemen were killed. Moscow blamed Israel, triggering a diplomatic crisis. Tensions eventually cooled, but the risk of escalation remains constant. The American role in all this is subtle, but significant. The US provides strategic support to Israel, including intelligence sharing and joint military planning. In eastern Syria, American forces maintain a presence at Al-Tanf, largely to counter Iranian-backed militias operating in the area. These militias, often composed of Afghan or Iraqi recruits, receive weapons and training from the IRGC. They are another piece of the growing Iranian footprint in Syria, a footprint Israel views as unacceptable. And behind all of this, there is the human toll. Syrian civilians, already battered by a decade of war, find themselves living among invisible battle lines. Israeli strikes rarely target civilians, but the fallout is unpredictable. A weapons depot near a school, a Hezbollah truck parked in a residential district. Miscalculations can be lethal. In 2021, a report by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimated that over 200 Iranian-affiliated fighters had been killed in Israeli strikes that year alone. Another UN report noted that Israeli air raids had damaged multiple civilian airports, delaying humanitarian aid shipments. There is no clean war here, just shadows piled on shadows. What's striking is how open the secret war has become. Both sides operate in a strange space between denial and declaration. Iran rarely admits casualties, but honors the dead in ceremonies back home. Israel doesn't claim responsibility, but Israeli newspapers often carry detailed maps of the bombed sites the morning after. It's like watching two rivals play a game of chess in a darkened room, both aware of every move but unwilling to say its name out loud. Some experts warn that this balance is unsustainable. The danger lies in a misstep, a drone that flies too far, a commander killed in the wrong place, an airstrike that hits a convoy carrying Russian or American advisors. The war in Syria is a proxy conflict, but the players are not minor. They are regional powers, nuclear-capable states, armed to the teeth and haunted by history. And yet, despite the constant risk, the war endures in its strange rhythm. Every few nights, the hum of engines over Damascus, a flash of light in the hills, a building reduced to smoke, then silence, until the next time. It is a quiet war, but not a forgotten one. In the quiet corridors of international diplomacy, deals are rarely made in the open. They're shaped in side rooms, over late-night calls, and scribbled notes passed between embassies. That was certainly the case with the Iran nuclear agreement, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Signed in July 2015 in Vienna, the JCPOA was the product of long and often agonizing negotiations between Iran and a group of world powers known as the P5+1. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, and Germany. At its heart, the deal aimed to curb Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon, in exchange for lifting the crushing economic sanctions that had strangled its economy for years. Iran agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98% and to limit its enrichment to 3.67%, far below the weapons-grade threshold. It also pledged to shut down most of its centrifuges and allow inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency full access to its nuclear facilities. The agreement was complex, meticulous, and, for many, a diplomatic triumph. But not for Israel. From the start, Israel viewed the JCPOA not as a solution, but as a dangerous gamble. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu became one of its most vocal critics. In a rare and dramatic move, he addressed the United States Congress in March 2015, without the White House's invitation. His message was stark and unyielding. The deal, he argued, paved Iran's path to the bomb rather than blocking it. This deal does not block Iran's path to the bomb, he said. It paves Iran's path to the bomb. Netanyahu feared that once the sunset clauses of the agreement expired, some in as little as 10 to 15 years, Iran would legally be able to ramp up its nuclear program. Even with restrictions, he claimed, Iran could hide illicit research in undisclosed facilities. And perhaps most alarmingly, the billions of dollars Iran regained through sanctions relief could, in Israel's view, be funneled to Hezbollah, the IRGC, and other proxy forces across the region. The Israeli intelligence community was divided. Some analysts acknowledged the deal's technical rigor and the value of daily inspections, but others echoed Netanyahu's concerns, arguing that Iran's ideological ambitions couldn't be curbed by paper and ink. In private briefings to foreign officials, Israeli defense leaders laid out maps of Iranian-backed militia positions in Syria and Lebanon, pointing to what they believed the freed-up Iranian funds were financing. Then came the turning point. In May 2018, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA. It was a move that stunned European allies and ignited fierce debate across diplomatic circles. The decision was heavily influenced by Israeli lobbying efforts and internal White House voices skeptical of Iran. Trump called it the worst deal ever and reinstated sanctions almost immediately, targeting everything from oil exports to banking channels. Over the following months, Iran's economy buckled under the renewed pressure. Inflation soared, the rial plummeted, and foreign investment evaporated. Washington also introduced a new policy, maximum pressure, aimed not just at containment, but regime destabilization. Iran responded in phases. At first, it tried to maintain compliance, hoping the Europeans would salvage the deal. But as promised, relief never came. Tehran began inching past the JCPOA's limits. It enriched uranium beyond 3.67%. Then it began installing advanced centrifuges. Soon, its stockpiles grew. By early 2021, Iran was enriching uranium up to 60% purity, dangerously close to weapons grade. International inspectors raised alarms. Diplomats issued statements. But the momentum had shifted. The carefully balanced agreement of 2015 had become a battlefield in a broader geopolitical war. Israel watched these developments with mounting anxiety. Military planners dusted off contingency strike plans. Satellite images of Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear facilities were reviewed almost daily. In public, Israeli officials repeated an old phrase, "All options are on the table," a not-so-subtle reference to potential military action. But Israel didn't just talk, it acted. In April 2021, a mysterious explosion crippled the power supply to Iran's Natanz facility. No one claimed responsibility, but many suspected Israeli involvement. Iranian officials called it an act of nuclear terrorism. The damage reportedly set back Iran's enrichment program by months. There were other signs. Mossad agents allegedly stole an entire archive of Iran's nuclear documents from a warehouse outside Tehran in 2018. The documents, smuggled back to Israel, were later presented at a press conference by Netanyahu, who held up binders and CDs as evidence of Iran's duplicity. The spectacle was theatrical, almost surreal, but it captured global headlines. Meanwhile, European signatories of the deal struggled to keep the JCPOA alive. They created a special financial mechanism, INSTX, to facilitate non-dollar trade with Iran, but it never gained traction. Companies, fearful of US penalties, stayed away. By 2022, negotiations for a new version of the JCPOA were stalled. Distrust had deepened on all sides. Iran wanted a guarantee that future US administrations wouldn't walk away again. The Americans couldn't promise that. Israeli officials warned that any new agreement must include tighter restrictions, missile controls, and a limit on Iran's regional activities. Demands that Tehran dismissed out of hand. The JCPOA, once a symbol of possibility, had become a ghost, lingering but powerless. It's worth remembering something here. The nuclear issue is not just about uranium and reactors. It's also about identity, pride, and fear. For Iran, the nuclear program represents sovereignty and defiance. For Israel, it's an existential threat, one that history has taught it to take seriously. In interviews, former Mossad chiefs have spoken with an eerie calm. One said, "It's not about if, it's about when. Iran wants the capability. The question is how far they will go and whether we'll let them." The uncertainty, the brinkmanship, the red lines, they all come together in this uneasy standoff. Diplomacy was supposed to diffuse it. For a while, it seemed to. But diplomacy, like all fragile things, can be broken. And once broken, it's not easily put back together. The ripples of change in the Middle East took on a new shape with the signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020, a development that altered the political landscape in ways few had anticipated. The Accords marked a historic moment, the normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and later Morocco and Sudan. It was a shift that echoed far beyond mere formalities, signaling a realignment of regional priorities and alliances. For decades, the Arab world had largely maintained a unified front in its stance toward Israel, shaped by the enduring Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian issue. Yet the Accords introduced a fresh, pragmatic element, a willingness to set aside old grievances to confront more immediate, pressing concerns. Iran's growing influence and assertiveness across the region loomed large as a shared threat. The warming ties between Israel and Gulf Arab states thus reflected an underlying fear, a quiet acknowledgement that Iran's ambitions could destabilize the entire region if left unchecked. Iran, for its part, perceived the Abraham Accords as a strategic blow. The rapprochement was seen not just as a diplomatic snub, but as an act of encirclement and isolation. Iranian officials and state media responded with sharp rhetoric, condemning the signatories as traitors to the Arab cause and accusing them of betrayal. They warned of harsh consequences and vowed to intensify support for their proxy groups throughout the Middle East. The fear was not unfounded. The Accords represented a clear shift in regional dynamics, one that left Iran more diplomatically isolated than it had been in decades. For the first time, Israel found itself with formal allies on its eastern and southern borders, states with sophisticated militaries, considerable economic clout, and advanced intelligence sharing capabilities. This new coalition implicitly challenged Iran's long-standing narrative of resistance and dominance in the region. As Iran's political leadership grappled with this new reality, the domestic context complicated matters further. Iran's economy had been battered by years of sanctions and the fallout from the JCPOA collapse. Public discontent simmered beneath the surface, punctuated by protests and calls for reform. Within this climate, the regime's hardline stance against Israel served multiple purposes. It consolidated internal support, diverted attention from economic woes, and reinforced the revolutionary ideology that defines the Islamic Republic. One striking example came in the form of escalating military rhetoric and occasional missile tests aimed at projecting strength. Public statements from the IRGC emphasized Iran's readiness to confront its adversaries and underscored its commitment to supporting resistance groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. It was a show of force, carefully calibrated to rally nationalistic sentiment and deter perceived aggression. Meanwhile, the Gulf states that signed the accords pursued a delicate balancing act. On the surface, they publicly affirmed their commitment to peace and cooperation, highlighting economic partnerships, technological exchange, and cultural diplomacy. But behind closed doors, security cooperation intensified, particularly concerning intelligence sharing about Iranian activities. For Israel, the Abraham Accords opened doors to new forms of engagement, economic, technological, and military, that had been impossible before. The exchange of technology in areas such as cybersecurity, drone warfare, and missile defense systems was particularly significant. The Gulf states' airspace became more accessible for Israeli aircraft, facilitating rapid responses to threats and joint surveillance efforts. But with these new alliances came new risks. Iran's proxies reacted with increased activity, launching attacks on infrastructure and maritime targets linked to the Gulf states and Israel. The Red Sea, a vital shipping route, saw heightened tensions as vessels were targeted or harassed. The pattern suggested a broader strategy by Iran to signal its displeasure and maintain leverage, while avoiding full-scale confrontation. Analysts have pointed out that the Abraham Accords may have accelerated Iran's sense of encirclement, feeding into a cycle of paranoia and aggressive posturing. According to an expert on Middle Eastern affairs, Iran views these agreements as a direct threat to its regional ambitions. It heightens their insecurity and strengthens their resolve to disrupt the emerging coalition. This sense of siege has intensified the long-standing conflict, shifting it from a primarily bilateral hostility to a more complex regional struggle. At the same time, the normalization movement has complicated the Palestinian issue further. Many Palestinians see the accords as a betrayal, perceiving their cause sidelined in favor of geopolitical calculations. This has deepened frustrations and occasionally spilled into protests and violent confrontations, adding another layer of tension to an already volatile environment. Yet, despite these challenges, the accords also offer glimpses of a potential path forward. The opening of diplomatic channels between Israel and Arab states could, in time, create spaces for dialogue and moderation. The shared economic interests, technology, tourism, energy, have a stabilizing potential if nurtured carefully. Some voices in the region argue that while the Iranian threat is real, peace and cooperation may gradually erode the old narratives of perpetual conflict. One particularly insightful commentary from a Gulf analyst noted, "The Abraham Accords represent a tectonic shift. While they heighten tensions with Iran, they also break decades of taboo. This is a first step, however fragile, towards a different Middle East, where coexistence might eventually replace confrontation." Nevertheless, the road ahead remains uncertain. Iran's hardliners have little appetite for compromise, and the proxy wars across Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen continue unabated. The accords have not led to a formal peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and unresolved grievances simmer beneath the surface. The delicate balance that now defines the Middle East is as much a test of political will as it is a reflection of deep-rooted history. The Abraham Accords, with their promises and pitfalls, have redefined the chessboard. Every move, every counter-move, carries the weight of decades of mistrust and the hope for a different future. The question lingers: will this new constellation of alliances hold, or will the region once again spiral into chaos? The answer, as always, lies buried in the quiet spaces between conflict and diplomacy, in the hopes and fears of millions who live under these shadows. The precarious nature of the current Middle Eastern landscape feels almost like a quiet tension hanging in the air, waiting for a single spark to ignite something far larger. With Iran's nuclear program accelerating steadily, the question on many minds is how close the region stands to an all-out confrontation. The reality is complex, layered with military posturing, diplomatic chess games, and a deep-rooted history of mistrust. Since the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Iran began to incrementally reduce its compliance, enriching uranium beyond agreed limits and installing advanced centrifuges at its facilities. By 2023, according to reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran's uranium enrichment had approached near weapons-grade levels. This development sent ripples of alarm throughout Israel and its allies. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in multiple speeches to the United Nations and the Knesset, has stressed a resolute stance. Israel will not allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. This vow is not an abstract threat, but a deeply ingrained policy, informed by historical lessons and existential fears. Israel's military readiness reflects this stance, with routine drills, heightened alert statuses, and intelligence operations focused on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Beyond drills, the Israeli Defense Forces have reportedly increased coordination with Gulf allies, further cementing the informal security umbrella that has been emerging since the Abraham Accords. The possibility of a preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities is a recurring theme in military and political discourse, even if official statements often remain cautious to avoid unnecessary escalation. Meanwhile, Iran's leadership views Israel's threats through a prism of defiance and deterrence. Statements from top Iranian officials emphasize the regime's capability to retaliate decisively if attacked, often underscored by references to missile stockpiles, proxy forces, and regional influence. The Revolutionary Guard continues to fortify its military presence in strategic locations, including Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, projecting power far beyond Iran's borders. This network of alliances complicates any potential conflict, as a strike against Iran could quickly trigger responses across multiple fronts. One of the most sensitive potential flashpoints is the Red Sea corridor, a crucial artery for global maritime trade and oil shipments. In recent years, attacks on commercial vessels, many suspected to be orchestrated or supported by Iranian proxies, have raised the stakes considerably. The Red Sea has thus become a strategic arena where covert clashes unfold beneath the surface of diplomacy. Israeli naval forces, alongside Gulf state counterparts, have increased patrols and surveillance, wary of sabotage attempts that could disrupt this vital waterway. Another tinderbox lies in the Golan Heights, the contested plateau that Israel captured from Syria in 1967. The area is a complex military zone, with Iranian-backed militias maintaining a presence just beyond Israeli lines. Skirmishes, drone incursions, and airstrikes have become almost routine. Israeli strikes targeting weapon transfers and bases in Syria continue unabated, while Iranian and Syrian forces respond with warnings and occasional retaliatory fire. The situation there serves as a microcosm of the broader regional conflict, volatile, unpredictable, and on the edge of a larger conflagration. Lebanon, too, remains a powder keg. Hezbollah's growing missile arsenal and deep ties to Iran make the northern border an ongoing concern for Israel's defense planners. The possibility of a renewed conflict looms especially large, given the political and economic instability within Lebanon itself. Analysts suggest that any significant deterioration in Lebanon's situation could provide fertile ground for Hezbollah to escalate hostilities. This scenario worries not only Israel, but also regional and global powers wary of a wider war. The international dimension further complicates matters. The United States remains a key player, providing military aid to Israel and maintaining a naval presence in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. However, Washington's policy has shifted somewhat in recent years, focusing on diplomatic containment rather than direct confrontation. European countries, while less vocally engaged, continue to express concern over Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional activities, advocating for renewed negotiations, but also supporting sanctions. Russia's role cannot be ignored, particularly given its military involvement in Syria and its broader strategic interests in the Middle East. Moscow often positions itself as a mediator, but also arms Iran's allies and maintains strong ties with Damascus. This triangulation adds layers of complexity, where any escalation risks drawing in multiple great powers with competing agendas. Wargame simulations conducted by various think tanks and military analysts paint a sobering picture. They highlight how quickly a localized incident, whether a misfired missile, a drone strike gone awry, or an attack on shipping could escalate into a broader conflict. The interconnected nature of the region's alliances means that a spark in one area might ignite fires elsewhere, with unpredictable consequences. Generals and experts interviewed over the past few years have often spoken about this fragility in quiet terms. One retired Israeli general, reflecting on the precariousness, said, "The balance we maintain is razor thin. One wrong calculation, one misinterpretation, and the region could be engulfed in war. It's a constant challenge to keep this fragile peace." Despite the tension, there is a shared understanding, however tenuous, of what is at stake. The horrors of past wars, the potential devastation of a nuclear conflict, and the economic costs weigh heavily on all sides. This awareness serves as a restraint, keeping the conflict simmering but largely contained. Still, the underlying fears remain potent. Israel's insistence on a nuclear-free Iran is unwavering. Iran's determination to maintain and expand its nuclear program, alongside its regional influence, is equally steadfast. The broader international community's efforts to mediate have faced repeated setbacks, caught between competing interests and hardened positions. It is in this fragile equilibrium that the future of the Middle East hangs, balanced between diplomacy and disaster. The risk of eruption is real, and the consequences profound. But amidst this tension lies a quiet hope that careful negotiation, strategic patience, and a willingness to understand might yet prevail, keeping the flames of war at bay. The unfolding story is far from over, shaped daily by decisions made behind closed doors and actions taken on distant battlefields. It is a reminder of how history, ideology, and realpolitik intertwine, and how the shadow of conflict continues to shape the lives of millions in a land ancient and ever-changing. The layers of conflict between Iran and Israel stretch deep, woven with history, ideology, and countless moments of fear and hostility. Yet beneath this intense animosity, a quieter question lingers. Could peace ever truly be possible between these two nations? It's a question that many find difficult to ask aloud, especially when the weight of decades of conflict presses so heavily on the present. But if we listen closely, the echoes of hope sometimes reveal themselves in unexpected places. Looking beyond the hardened rhetoric and political posturing, there are voices, both Iranian and Israeli, that speak of reconciliation, understanding, and a shared yearning for stability. Iranian dissidents who oppose the current regime often express a desire for change, one that would move the country away from ideological hostility and toward more open relations with the outside world. One such figure, Masih Alinejad, a journalist and activist, has spoken openly about how many Iranians long for peace and the chance to live without the constant shadow of conflict. "Most people want the same things everywhere," she once said. Peace, opportunity, a future for their children. On the Israeli side, peace activists have for decades worked to build bridges, sometimes at great personal risk. Organizations dedicated to dialogue, cultural exchange, and mutual understanding emphasize that hatred is not inevitable, but cultivated by political forces that benefit from division. These activists highlight how cultural and religious ties between Jewish and Persian civilizations run deep, even if often overshadowed by contemporary politics. The centuries-old Persian Jewish community serves as a reminder that coexistence has existed and could again. The geopolitical landscape, however, remains challenging. Ideological narratives, such as the Islamic Republic's framing of Israel as an existential enemy, continue to drive policies that reject dialogue outright. Simultaneously, Israel's security concerns, shaped by memories of past wars and ongoing threats from proxy groups, foster a posture of vigilance and preemption. These stances have hardened over time, and for many, the cost of change seems too high. Yet, history shows that no conflict is immutable. Generational shifts can bring new perspectives. Young Iranians today, despite censorship and propaganda, access information from around the world and express complex views that sometimes diverge from official ideology. Similarly, younger Israelis, shaped by a globalized world and the memory of multiple wars, are not monolithic in their approach to peace. Polls have shown fluctuating levels of support for diplomatic engagement, especially when paired with tangible steps towards security and normalization. Another important factor is the role of external pressures and shared concerns. The broader Middle East is a region marked by instability, economic challenges, and the rise of extremism. Both Iran and Israel face threats that transcend their rivalry: terrorism, economic sanctions, and political upheaval that demand cooperation or at least a reduction in hostilities. Some analysts speculate that shared interests, such as countering radical groups or managing regional crises, could serve as starting points for dialogue. The possibility of a shared enemy or mutual strategic benefit is a recurring theme in conflict resolution. In this case, shifting alliances in the Middle East and global politics might one day push Iran and Israel toward a tacit understanding. The complex dance of diplomacy in recent years, with quiet back-channel talks reported occasionally, hence that even the most entrenched conflicts sometimes find moments of reprieve. Cultural connections offer another, often overlooked avenue toward peace. Persian literature, poetry, and art have long been cherished in Israeli intellectual circles, while Persian Jews maintain traditions that fuse Iranian and Jewish heritage. These threads of shared human experience may one day form a foundation for greater empathy, even if political barriers remain for now. At the same time, the path to peace is fraught with challenges. Extremism on all sides, political hardliners, and the scars of violence create deep mistrust. Internal politics within both countries can swing toward confrontation, as leaders rally nationalist sentiment or divert attention from domestic issues. The volatile nature of the region means that even hopeful advances risk being derailed by unforeseen events. Still, the human stories beneath the headlines offer a glimpse of what might be possible. Families divided by borders but connected by heritage, artists who find inspiration across cultures, and ordinary people who dream of a day when fear no longer governs their lives. These quiet narratives often go unnoticed, yet they carry the seeds of change. Reflecting on all this, one might wonder what would need to happen for the hostility to fall. Could a major internal revolution in Iran, one that shifts the ideological core of the regime, open the door for new relations? Might generational change in Israel lead to a greater willingness to compromise? Could regional dynamics, such as a new security framework involving Gulf states and global powers, provide the conditions for peace? Geopolitical analysts often caution against simplistic answers, emphasizing that peace is a long and delicate process. Yet the history of conflict and reconciliation worldwide suggests that even the most entrenched hatreds can be transformed, given time, courage, and a willingness to understand the other's humanity. As the night deepens and this story draws to a close, it's worth remembering that history is not just the story of power and war, but also of people. People who endure, dream, and hope beyond the divisions imposed upon them. The secret history behind Iran and Israel's hatred is a tale of rivalry, but within it lies the quiet possibility of change. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a complex and often misunderstood chapter of our world story. Until the next late night story, may your thoughts be calm and your dreams peaceful. If you found this exploration meaningful, gentle like or subscription helps us keep these quiet stories alive. Good night.